This is my true story. My son, the one I raised with care, said words that cut deeper than knives. "You're just a useless old man." I never expected my own child to treat me like this. Years of sacrifice, nights of hard work, and endless patience seemed forgotten in a single sentence. I sat there, stunned, my heart heavy, my spirit shaken. But I did not give in to despair. I made a choice that would change everything. Before I tell you how, please tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And subscribe to this channel so my stories reach more people. I spent decades working tirelessly to raise my son. I woke before dawn every day, even when my body ached, to provide for him. I skipped meals so he could eat, wore old and worn-out clothes to ensure he had what he needed. I labored through the years, believing that every drop of sweat, every sacrifice, would be honored someday. I imagined him growing into a man who would carry my name with pride and respect. I hoped that when I grew old, he would stand by me, grateful for the life I gave him. I poured my heart into every lesson, teaching him to be honest, hardworking, and loyal. I worked 2 jobs at times, leaving before sunrise and returning after sunset, just so he could attend school comfortably. Every small joy I denied myself, I gave him. A new pair of shoes, books to read, meals on the table. I thought my sacrifices would plant seeds of gratitude, understanding, and love in his heart. I believed that he would understand, one day, the weight of what it meant to give everything for someone else. Never once did I imagine that the hands I raised to respect would one day strike me, or the words I taught him to honor would turn into weapons of insult. I remember the nights when I held him as a baby, whispering promises of safety and love. I remember teaching him to ride a bicycle, steadying him when he wobbled, never letting him fall too hard. I remember the first time he brought home a report card, and I rejoiced quietly, proud of his achievements. All those memories, all that effort I thought would create a bond stronger than time itself. I believed that family ties, nurtured with patience and care, could survive any storm. I never considered that my own child could betray the very foundation I built for him. Even when I grew tired, my love did not waver. Even when my body ached, I carried on with the hope that my devotion would be recognized. I spent countless nights planning his future, worrying about his education, and securing his path to success. Every penny I saved, every corner I cut in my own comfort, I did for him, believing a father's reward lies in the happiness of his child. I assumed that my labor would create respect and understanding, and that one day he would repay the devotion with care. I never imagined that instead my labor would be met with ridicule, scorn, and contempt. I worked long hours in silence, never complaining, never seeking praise. I endured hunger and cold, illness and exhaustion, all in order to give my son an advantage in life. I carried his burdens in my mind, worrying about his safety, his growth, and his choices. I gave guidance when asked, corrected gently when I saw mistakes, and celebrated when he succeeded. I believed love meant sacrifice, and sacrifice meant respect would follow naturally. I trusted that the years of hardship would forge gratitude and reverence in his heart. I even allowed him small indulgences that I denied myself, hoping to make his childhood bright. I saved for vacations, bought toys, ensured his room was comfortable, even when my own home lacked luxuries. I stayed awake at night to listen to his worries, giving advice and reassurance whenever he came to me. I thought that the warmth of a father's devotion was a shield, protecting him from life's hardships. I never considered that the very shield I created could be turned against me, used to fuel contempt rather than care. I assumed that decades of care, patience, and toil would cement our bond beyond words, beyond anger, beyond betrayal. Every scar on my hands, every ache in my back, every sleepless night was a testament to devotion. I labored through storms, illness, and fatigue because a father's work is never truly done. I invested every ounce of strength and hope into his life, believing the fruit of sacrifice would someday bloom. I built him a life on the foundations of patience, perseverance, and love, assuming he would honor it. I thought that the lessons of respect, responsibility, and gratitude would take root naturally in a young heart nurtured by care. I never thought the same heart could twist into cruelty, mockery, and disdain. As I grew older, my body tired, but my spirit clung to hope. I believed that my son would see the life I gave him, understand the hardships I endured, and appreciate the strength it took to raise him. I believed he would honor the man who had given him everything, even when the world failed him. I could not fathom that the hands I had held, the lessons I had given, the sacrifices I had made, could be met with insults and violence. I never imagined that the fruit of my devotion would turn into betrayal and pain. Yet, in those moments of disbelief, I began to realize that love alone is not always enough to command respect. I reflected on the years spent raising him, and a quiet sorrow settled in my chest. I realized that every tear I had wiped away, every wound I had bandaged, every fear I had soothed, might be met with scorn. I began to understand that some lessons, some betrayals, could only be answered with action, not hope. The devotion I had poured into him could not shield me from contempt, but it could give me strength to reclaim dignity. I realized that the same patience I used to nurture him would now be the foundation of my resolve. Every sacrifice I had made was not wasted because it had forged in me the courage to face betrayal without breaking. I knew that the time would come when the love of a father had to meet the reality of a son's cruelty. I understood that years of devotion had built not only him, but me, an enduring spirit capable of standing against disrespect. I acknowledged that the world does not always repay kindness with gratitude and effort with loyalty. But I also knew that truth and patience would be the instruments of justice. I realized that while I could not change his heart, I could protect my own dignity and claim respect. The years of devotion had prepared me for this moment, the moment to transform pain into power, insult into exposure, and betrayal into consequence. As my son grew older, I noticed the distance between us widening. The laughter we once shared became rare, replaced by tension and cold glances. He began ignoring my advice, treating my words as if they were nonsense. Every suggestion I gave, meant to guide him, was dismissed or mocked. I watched him value money, pride, and appearances more than the lessons I had spent decades teaching. The love I had poured into him seemed invisible in the glow of his arrogance. The boy who once clung to my hand for comfort now avoided my gaze entirely. He walked past me without a word, shrugging off my concerns, as if I were nothing more than background noise. He spoke harshly, raising his voice for minor issues, refusing to acknowledge the sacrifices I had made. Even family gatherings became tense, as he made it clear he felt no obligation to respect his father. I tried to remain patient, believing that youth and immaturity were to blame for this growing rift. I hoped that with time, he would return to the understanding he once had as a child. I watched as neighbors and friends noticed his lack of respect. They whispered behind closed doors, mentioning how cruelly he treated me, yet he seemed unaware. The man I raised to honor family values now stood indifferent to my presence. It pained me to see him prioritize his own comfort and success over the very person who had given him everything. I remembered the nights I worked extra hours, the meals I skipped, the sleepless nights I endured. All of it seemed forgotten, erased by his rising pride and disregard. I began to sense a change in my own heart, a mixture of sorrow and anger. I knew I had nurtured him with patience, hope, and sacrifice, but my efforts were being met with scorn. The bond we once shared, built with love and care, felt fragile and strained. I questioned if all my years of devotion would be remembered, or if they would be lost in the shadow of disrespect. Every gentle word I offered was now met with indifference or even disdain. Every act of guidance seemed to fuel his arrogance instead of teaching humility. I tried to reach out in quiet ways, offering advice subtly, avoiding confrontation. I reminded myself that time and maturity often soften youthful arrogance, but each attempt was met with increasing impatience and dismissiveness. The boy who once sought comfort in my arms now refused even basic conversation. I realized that my presence was no longer seen as supportive, but as an inconvenience. Even small corrections were met with anger, as if my very existence challenged his independence. Family celebrations became exercises in restraint for me. I could not join in without being reminded of his growing contempt. Every smile from me seemed ignored. Every word of caution met with eye rolls and sharp words. I felt the weight of isolation even when surrounded by others, because the one I loved most had turned cold. It was a silent cruelty, invisible to the world but deeply felt in my heart. I began to understand that the growing distance was not only emotional but also dangerous for my dignity. I reflected on the years I had spent raising him, remembering the moments when he had been my pride and joy. The same hands that once held mine in trust now rejected me in arrogance. The voice that had once called my name in excitement now spoke in mockery and contempt. I began to see that my patience and devotion alone could not bridge the growing gap. I realized that something had to change, that I could not continue to endure humiliation silently. The growing distance between us was more than physical. It had become a chasm of disrespect and defiance. I understood that the man he was becoming might never value my love, but I could still reclaim my own power. I knew that ignoring his behavior would only embolden him, that silence might be interpreted as weakness. I could no longer depend on hope alone. I had to act, to restore boundaries and command respect. I prepared myself mentally for the steps I would take, gathering courage and clarity. The growing distance had revealed a painful truth. Love without action can allow cruelty to flourish. I realized that sometimes a father must protect his dignity before hoping to regain a child's respect. Each day, I observed his behavior carefully, noting moments of disrespect and aggression. I kept mental records of the insults, the neglect, and the arrogance, knowing they would inform my next move. Every refusal to acknowledge my presence, every dismissive remark became evidence of the chasm between us. I reminded myself that his success and pride were built on a fragile foundation, one that could crumble if exposed. I decided that the time would come when the lesson of respect had to be demonstrated, not just spoken. The growing distance had become a catalyst, preparing me to act decisively to protect my dignity. I knew that bridging the gap with words alone was no longer possible. The lessons of humility and respect I had tried to instill had failed because they were ignored and mocked. I realized that action, not patience, would be the instrument to restore balance. The emotional distance had revealed a practical truth. Consequences must follow disrespect. I prepared to use all the knowledge and experience I had gathered over a lifetime to address the betrayal. The growing distance was no longer a threat to our relationship. It was a signal that a decisive step was necessary. I reflected on my own strength, forged over decades of labor, patience, and love. I recognized that the same devotion I had given to him could now fuel the courage to face his disrespect. The distance he created could not break me. It could only push me toward a solution that preserved dignity. I realized that the lessons I had once offered in kindness must now be delivered in truth and consequence. I acknowledged the sorrow of the situation, but resolved that justice, not bitterness, would guide my actions. The growing distance, painful as it was, had prepared me for the moment when love and authority would converge into a single act of resolve. One evening, after another tense argument, my son's words cut deeper than any blow. He shouted at me with a voice filled with contempt, "You're just a useless old man." Those words struck my heart like a hammer against stone, sharp and heavy. All the years I had worked, all the nights I had sacrificed sleep for his future, seemed to vanish in an instant. The patience I had nurtured over decades turned into a fire of disbelief and hurt. I stood frozen, absorbing the weight of his insult, feeling the gravity of betrayal and disrespect. The phrase echoed in my mind, repeating endlessly, a relentless reminder of how little I was valued. I had raised him with love, had given him a home, food, guidance, and protection. Every effort I had made, every personal hardship I had endured for his comfort, seemed meaningless. This was the child I had cradled in my arms, the boy I had encouraged and supported unconditionally. Now, his words tore at my very existence, questioning my worth and identity. I realized that the son I knew had been replaced by a stranger who mocked my presence. Even as I processed the insult, I tried to maintain composure, holding back anger and tears. I recalled the sacrifices I had made for him, from working overtime to skipping meals so he could thrive. I remembered every moment I had guided him, hoping he would grow into a man of respect and integrity. Now, he dismissed my guidance as irrelevant, laughed at my experience, and scorned my existence. The insult was not just words. It represented years of emotional investment and devotion reduced to nothing. It pierced deeper than any physical pain, wounding my dignity and shaking my spirit. I noticed the silence that followed the outburst, the stillness that filled the room after his harsh words. It was as if the world paused to recognize the cruelty in what had been spoken. I could feel the tension building, the anger rising slowly but surely within me. I realized that this moment would not be forgotten, that it would become a turning point. It was a clear signal that tolerance and patience alone could no longer protect me. The insult demanded a response, a careful, measured action that would restore balance and respect. I reflected on every warning sign that had come before this incident, every harsh tone, every dismissive glance, every sneer or sarcastic remark had led to this breaking point. I acknowledged that my son's arrogance had grown unchecked, nurtured by my silence and hope for change. I understood that his words, though cruel, were a symptom of a deeper problem, a lack of respect ingrained in his character. This realization strengthened my resolve to act, to turn his insult into an opportunity to teach a lasting lesson. I would not allow his contempt to define me or undermine the authority I had built over a lifetime. Even as anger simmered, I remained calm, knowing that an impulsive reaction could weaken my position. I thought carefully about how to transform this moment of pain into one of power and dignity. I understood that true revenge would not come from retaliation, but from strategy and truth. I decided that the insult must meet a consequence visible to him, undeniable and permanent. I began preparing mentally for the steps I would take, envisioning how justice would unfold. The insult had lit a fire, but it would be channeled through methodical, deliberate action. I also considered the impact on the family and the community around us. I knew that the lesson would be more effective if it were undeniable, seen, and respected by others. The insult had stripped me of silence, leaving only the clarity of necessity and moral authority. I reflected on the years I had built a life filled with dignity, patience, and sacrifice. I could not allow one person, even my own son, to erase that legacy with words. This insult became the catalyst for action that would protect my dignity and establish accountability. I prepared for the confrontation in my mind, not with violence, but with facts, evidence, and courage. I reviewed every bruise, every sign of abuse, every documented instance of disrespect and defiance. I realized that words like useless old man could be answered with truth and consequence, not argument. The insult had unveiled the necessity for public accountability, a lesson that could not be ignored. I understood that my silence would no longer shield him. It would only allow cruelty to continue unchecked. I resolved that the insult would not define me. Instead, it would define the moment I reclaimed control. In those moments of reflection, I felt both sorrow and strength intertwined. Sorrow for the child I had loved and nurtured, and strength for the man I had become through decades of experience. I recognized that the insult, though painful, was an opportunity to assert authority without surrendering compassion. I understood that dignity could not be preserved through silence alone, especially against repeated disrespect. I committed myself to turning this moment of humiliation into a demonstration of truth and justice. The insult, though designed to wound, would ultimately reveal his weaknesses and restore my honor. Every fiber of my being focused on the plan I had formed. I would act not in anger, but in measured, undeniable clarity. I would ensure that the disrespect he voiced so freely would meet a consequence proportionate to his cruelty. The insult would not be ignored, denied, or brushed aside. It would be recorded, documented and addressed in a manner that he could neither evade nor erase. The son who shouted, "Useless old man," would witness the enduring power of truth and dignity firsthand. I understood that patience had limits and that tolerance had an expiration date. The years of being mocked and ignored had culminated in this moment, demanding action. I prepared myself mentally and emotionally for the steps I would take to protect my dignity. The insult became a turning point, a signal that justice and consequence must be applied without hesitation. I knew that by responding wisely, I would transform a moment of shame into a lesson of respect. The son's words, meant to wound, would instead illuminate the path of responsibility and accountability. After enduring the harsh words, the reality of his cruelty became physical. The verbal assaults soon escalated into violence, leaving bruises across my arms, back, and face. Every slap, push, and shove became a mark of pain, a reminder of betrayal from my own son. I tried to cover them with long sleeves, hoping no one would see the shame I carried. Yet each bruise was a testament to the disrespect and hatred that had grown unchecked. The pain was constant, a silent companion in every movement and thought I had. I kept the marks hidden, not out of fear, but out of a desire to endure quietly. Every time I looked in the mirror, the reflection showed a man beaten not just physically, but emotionally. I remembered nights when I had stayed awake, worried for his future, praying he would become better. All that hope seemed wasted now, replaced by a bitter awareness of the reality I faced. I realized that these physical reminders could also become the key to justice. If documented correctly, they could show the world the depth of his cruelty. I began recording each bruise meticulously, taking photographs and keeping notes. I documented the dates, times, and circumstances of each attack, leaving no detail forgotten. The evidence grew steadily, a collection of proof that spoke louder than my voice ever could. I labeled each image carefully, making sure the story was clear without any embellishment. Each photo was a silent witness to his actions, capturing what my son wanted to deny. I understood that these images were more than bruises. They were the key to restoring my dignity. The process of collecting evidence was painful, but necessary. I recalled the long years of sacrifice, the sleepless nights, and the hardships endured to provide for him. Each bruise reminded me of the moments I had been ignored, mocked, and attacked. Yet in this recording, I found a sense of control I hadn't felt in years. I realized that through careful documentation, I could transform suffering into action. The bruises became a map of his cruelty, pointing the way to the lesson he needed to learn. I also began writing down the context of each incident, detailing what led to the violence. The anger, the insults, and the reckless behavior that caused the physical abuse were all recorded. I noted my attempts to calm the situation, to reason with him, and to de-escalate conflict. Nothing was left to chance. Everything was documented so that truth could not be denied. I understood that these records would serve as undeniable proof to authorities. Through this process, my pain became preparation, shaping a path toward justice and accountability. As the days passed, the collection of evidence grew, and my resolve strengthened. I reviewed each photo, each note, and relived the moments in quiet reflection. I acknowledged the hurt, but I also acknowledged my responsibility to act wisely. This was not about revenge for anger's sake, but about teaching a lesson that could not be ignored. I understood that my silence in the past had allowed the abuse to continue. Now, with proof in hand, I could speak through evidence rather than words. The bruises also reminded me of the vulnerability I had faced as a father. They symbolized the betrayal of someone I had nurtured, the pain inflicted by my own child. Yet they also represented the strength I carried within, the endurance of decades of life experience. Through them, I realized that justice could be measured not only by punishment, but by accountability. Every mark became a tool to ensure that cruelty would not go unchecked. The bruises, once sources of shame, were now instruments of clarity and empowerment. I began storing the evidence carefully, ensuring nothing could be lost or tampered with. Photographs were backed up, notes organized, and every detail kept in order. I knew that when the time came, the presentation of this proof would be undeniable. It would show clearly to authorities, neighbors, and even his colleagues that the disrespect was real. No longer could his words or actions be dismissed or hidden behind arrogance. The physical evidence spoke volumes, louder than any confrontation or argument could ever do. I reflected on the journey that brought me here, from patient father to one prepared for decisive action. Every bruise was a reminder of his disrespect, but also of my endurance and foresight. I realized that justice would not come from anger alone, but through strategic, undeniable evidence. Each mark was a chapter in the story of betrayal and the preparation for redemption. I understood that the time had come to act, to transform suffering into meaningful consequence. The bruises, once sources of pain, had become the foundation for restoring respect and dignity. I also considered the impact of this evidence on the broader community. Neighbors, colleagues, and friends would see the truth, and it would hold weight far beyond my household. The proof was not for revenge alone. It was for teaching accountability and showing that cruelty carries consequences. Every bruise documented would remind others that words and actions have power. It would also ensure that my son could no longer hide behind arrogance and impunity. Through the careful collection of bruises and evidence, I reclaimed authority and self-respect. Finally, I took a deep breath and acknowledged that the journey from pain to empowerment was nearly complete. The bruises were no longer just reminders of violence. They were tools for justice. I felt a sense of readiness, knowing that the next steps would deliver the lesson my son needed. Every photo, every note, every detail prepared me for the decisive moment that would change everything. The bruises had silently spoken long enough. Now they would speak through action. I realized that truth, when documented and presented, is more powerful than any argument or plea. After documenting every bruise and insult, I sat quietly in my chair, reflecting on the next step. The anger and pain within me were strong, but I knew impulsive action would only weaken my plan. I understood that silence alone had allowed the abuse to continue, and words would no longer suffice. I needed a strategy that combined patience, evidence, and decisiveness to teach a lasting lesson. Every moment of reflection reminded me of the years I had invested in raising him properly. Decades of care, guidance, and sacrifice could not be undone, yet they could be defended through action. I realized that a public lesson would carry weight far beyond our home. Confronting him privately might lead to denials, lies, and empty promises, undoing any chance of change. The moment had to be precise, undeniable, and permanent, so the truth could not be ignored. I knew involving authorities would not only protect me, but also ensure the lesson reached him clearly. It was not about anger or revenge alone, but about restoring dignity and respect to our home. Every detail I had gathered in the past weeks now became the foundation for this plan. I reviewed the photographs and notes again, ensuring nothing was missing. Each mark, each bruise, each incident had been recorded meticulously to leave no room for doubt. The proof had to be undeniable, and I made sure every detail was correct and organized. I understood that presenting the evidence calmly would speak louder than any shouted accusation. There was power in patience, in letting the truth shine on its own. I also acknowledged the fear and hesitation within me, but I did not let it dictate my decision. The more I reflected, the clearer the path became. I could not allow fear, pride, or emotional attachment to cloud my judgment. Every slap, every insult, every bruise had led to this moment of decisive action. I understood that demonstrating authority through evidence would leave a permanent mark on him. It was no longer about anger or hurt. It was about teaching responsibility and respect. The quiet decision required courage, planning, and unwavering commitment to truth. I considered the outcome carefully. The consequences had to be immediate and undeniable. The goal was to ensure he recognized the impact of his cruelty on me and our household. I knew that once the authorities saw the evidence, he could no longer dismiss or manipulate the situation. The lesson had to be permanent, leaving an impression that would last a lifetime. I thought about how the neighbors, colleagues, and even friends would witness justice being served. The weight of public acknowledgement would reinforce the importance of respect and boundaries. I also reflected on my own feelings, ensuring they did not overshadow the plan. Fear, sadness, and anger were natural, but they could not dictate the next step. I reminded myself that the objective was dignity and truth, not revenge for revenge's sake. Each bruise and each insult had prepared me for this decisive moment. The evidence I had collected became my voice, louder than words or confrontation ever could. I understood that silence was over. Action was necessary to reclaim control and respect. I prepared myself mentally for what was to come. I visualized calmly presenting the evidence, explaining the situation without raising my voice. Every photo and note would be shown clearly, leaving no space for lies or excuses. I felt a quiet determination, understanding that my strength lay in preparation, not aggression. The decision to act was not impulsive, but calculated, designed to teach a lesson that could not be forgotten. I also knew that this approach would protect me from further abuse while holding him accountable. I reflected on the long journey that brought me to this point. From patient father to the man documenting every wrong, I had learned the importance of planning. The bruises, words, and insults were not just pain. They were tools for ensuring justice. Each moment of suffering strengthened my resolve to act decisively and wisely. I realized that my quiet decision would speak louder than any argument or confrontation ever could. Action would replace silence, and dignity would replace fear. Finally, I understood that this quiet decision required complete focus. There would be no anger-driven mistakes, no hasty moves that could backfire. Every step had to be measured, every action deliberate, every proof undeniable. I knew that when the time came to call the authorities, the moment would carry the weight of decades of pain. The bruises, once hidden, would now serve their ultimate purpose. Through this quiet, calculated decision, I was ready to reclaim my life and dignity. I reflected on the lessons learned through all the pain endured. The patience, endurance, and careful documentation had all led to this pivotal choice. I understood that the quiet decision was the most powerful step I could take. The authority of truth, supported by evidence, would deliver a lesson that no words could match. The silence of months of abuse was about to be replaced by action and justice. I was ready, calm, and resolute, knowing this quiet decision would change everything. The moment the officers stepped into my home, I felt a mixture of anxiety and relief. Years of silence, endurance, and hidden pain had led to this instant. I removed the long sleeves that had concealed the evidence of abuse. Every mark, every bruise on my arms, shoulders, and chest told a story. I had kept meticulous records, each photo taken with precision and care. The officers looked closely, their eyes widening at the depth of the injuries. The bruises were more than colors on skin. They were a testament to years of patience and suffering endured in silence. Each discoloration represented nights of quiet endurance, nights of hidden tears. Every swelling and mark spoke louder than words ever could. The police officers remained calm, but visibly shocked at the reality before them. I felt a strange sense of empowerment, knowing that truth was finally visible. I showed them the record I had kept, each incident documented carefully. The notes included dates, times, and descriptions of each act of violence. Every bruise photographed, every mark logged meticulously, leaving no doubt. The old man who had suffered in silence now held undeniable evidence. I did not raise my voice. I did not plead for help. I simply presented the facts, letting the truth speak for itself. The officers inspected every detail, taking notes and confirming the story. I explained each bruise, each incident, recounting the history of abuse. It was not just physical pain, it was emotional, the erosion of dignity and trust. They listened attentively, asking questions when necessary. Understanding the gravity, I realized that the long years of endurance had prepared me for this moment. The weight of shame had finally transformed into the weight of truth. As the evidence was acknowledged, I felt a growing sense of calm. The fear that had lived in my chest for years began to loosen its grip. For the first time, I felt a sense of power returning, not through force, but through proof. The police now had everything they needed to act, and I stood quietly. The act of showing my bruises was more powerful than any shouting or pleading. Respect was about to be restored through undeniable reality, not anger. Neighbors, who had always turned a blind eye, now peeked from their windows. Whispers of surprise and concern floated through the street outside. They saw the police inside, examining the marks, taking the situation seriously. The son's arrogance and defiance, long unchecked, was about to meet consequence. I felt no anger in that moment, only the quiet strength of justice. Years of pain and endurance had culminated into an undeniable truth. The officers asked me to step back while they assessed the situation fully. I complied, standing still, knowing that the evidence was enough to act. There was no need for theatrics, no need for argument. The bruises themselves told a story of cruelty, disregard, and disrespect. Each mark documented, each photo recorded, removed any doubt. The power of visibility had replaced the long months of hidden suffering. I reflected silently on the irony that the very acts of violence that had hurt me would now serve as the instrument of accountability. The years of abuse had built a case that could not be ignored or denied. The old man who had been mocked, insulted, and beaten was now in control. Control, not through retaliation, but through truth and careful preparation. Each bruise and mark became a symbol of justice about to be delivered. The son, unaware that the authorities had been called, would soon face the consequences. I knew the moment of confrontation would be humbling, necessary, and permanent. I felt a sense of satisfaction, not from vengeance, but from righting a wrong. The act of showing the bruises transformed years of silent pain into action. It was a quiet, dignified assertion of truth that no words could overshadow. For the first time in years, the power of respect returned to the rightful place. Finally, I stood silently, letting the officers do their work. They had all the evidence, all the details, and all the proof needed. I had done my part with patience, courage, and precision. The bruises, once symbols of suffering, were now instruments of justice. The son's arrogance would crumble under the weight of undeniable truth. The house, long a place of fear, was about to become a place of restored dignity. The moment had finally arrived. The officers, with calm authority, moved towards my son, ready to enforce the law. I watched silently, standing tall, despite the lingering pain and bruises. Years of insult, violence, and disrespect had built up to this exact instant. I felt no fear, only a quiet determination that justice would now unfold. Theson's expression shifted from arrogance to confusion as he saw the police. He tried to speak, to justify, to deny the reality before him. But the truth was undeniable, displayed on my arms, my chest, my carefully kept records. The officers, firm yet composed, placed handcuffs around his wrists. The metal clicked into place, a sound heavier than any words could carry. His resistance was useless against the weight of evidence and law. Years of cruelty, mocking, and insults were finally met with consequence. Neighbors peered from their doors and windows, watching with wide eyes. Whispers and murmurs traveled quickly along the street outside. They had seen the bruises, they had known the words, and now the action unfolded. The son, proud and defiant in private, was humbled publicly for the first time. The sight was not about humiliation for its own sake, but about learning respect. The police escorted him outside, each step a lesson in accountability. I felt a mixture of relief and calm satisfaction. Years of silent suffering were finally being acknowledged in the only way that mattered. The handcuffs were a symbol not of vengeance, but of justice restored. The arrogance that had defined his actions melted into fear and shame. Neighbors whispered, some nodding silently, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The act of law enforcement had transformed my long-suppressed courage into visible power. He struggled, yelling and protesting, but no words could erase the truth. The bruises, the records, and the careful documentation spoke louder than his voice. I stood behind him, silent, allowing the consequences to sink in fully. Years of mockery, abuse, and disrespect had led to this undeniable outcome. His pride, once inflated and untouchable, now lay shattered before the public eye. Each cuffed step reinforced the lesson that words and violence have consequences. The officers explained each procedure calmly, ensuring the process remained controlled. I watched carefully, knowing that patience had brought us to this moment. The son's reputation, built on defiance and arrogance, began to crumble instantly. Neighbors exchanged glances, realizing the reality of his actions and the impact on the family. It was a public display of justice, necessary to teach a lesson that words alone could not. The experience would be remembered not as shame, but as truth unveiled. As they led him to the police vehicle, I felt a wave of relief. The long nights of suffering, the hidden pain, and the quiet endurance had finally mattered. The act of arrest was not personal revenge, but the fulfillment of justice long delayed. Every step he took was a reminder that cruelty and disrespect carry weight. The police ensured he understood the seriousness of the situation, documenting each action. Neighbors continued to watch, silently acknowledging the truth they had only suspected. The son's defiance had been a shield for years, protecting him from accountability. Now that shield had crumbled, replaced by the undeniable authority of law and truth. I stood quietly, feeling the balance of power finally restored in my favor. The handcuffs, the evidence, and the presence of officers had neutralized his arrogance. The street outside was filled with silent witnesses, absorbing the lesson of respect. For the first time in years, the old man's dignity was not questioned, but acknowledged. Inside, I reflected on the path that led to this arrest. Years of patience, careful documentation, and silent suffering had been necessary. No shouting, no impulsive reactions, only deliberate action had achieved this outcome. I had transformed humiliation into power and disrespect into accountability. Every bruise I bore, every insult I endured, had prepared me for this moment. Justice was no longer a concept. It had become a visible, undeniable reality. The son, handcuffed and subdued, had no recourse left. His arrogance and cruelty, unchecked for so long, had finally been met with consequence. Neighbors would remember this moment, a lesson that respect cannot be demanded but enforced. The police officers executed their duties with professionalism, reinforcing the severity of the situation. The visual and public nature of the arrest ensured the lesson would endure beyond words. Years of silent endurance had finally transformed into visible, undeniable justice. I watched as the vehicle doors closed and the officers prepared to take him away. Relief washed over me, mingled with a quiet pride in the methodical patience I had exercised. No screams, no retaliations, only the calm, deliberate execution of truth. The handcuffs had done what words and pleas could not, restore balance and respect. The neighbors would tell the story for weeks, and the lesson would be remembered. The old man, once mocked and bruised, had regained his dignity and authority. The arrest marked a turning point, not just for my son, but for the household. Peace, respect, and quiet authority replaced fear, shame, and insult. The years of patient endurance had achieved what anger and retaliation could never. The son's arrogance had been shattered, replaced by the clarity of consequences. Neighbors, witnesses to the truth, now understood the depth of what had occurred. The act was not revenge. It was the restoration of order and justice, long overdue. As the police vehicle disappeared down the street, I felt the weight lift. The bruises, though still sore, no longer symbolized weakness or defeat. They were the markers of truth, endurance, and eventual justice. I had shown the world, and my son, that disrespect cannot survive in silence. The public nature of the arrest reinforced the lesson for everyone, including him. Years of quiet suffering had transformed into undeniable authority and respect regained. Standing there, I reflected on the journey from insult to action. Every bruise, every mark, every insult had been recorded meticulously. The patience and calm that guided my actions now bore fruit in justice. The handcuffs symbolized accountability, respect, and the power of truth. Neighbors, police, and even my son now understood that cruelty cannot prevail. The quiet man, once dismissed and mocked, had finally been heard, and respected. The arrest was only the beginning of change. The house, once filled with tension, fear, and harsh words, felt different immediately. A quiet authority had returned to its walls, unseen but undeniable. The son, once proud and defiant, had lost his arrogance under public scrutiny. The neighbors whispered, watched, and slowly began to treat the family with respect. Even my own children noticed the shift, sensing the balance restored. The son returned later under warning, the handcuffs removed but the lesson engraved. No amount of anger or argument could erase the memory of the public arrest. His friends and colleagues had heard, rumors had spread, and reputation had been shattered. He avoided the neighbors' eyes and remained silent at home, subdued for the first time. I noticed the difference immediately, the change in tone and posture. Respect was returning, not by force, but by consequence. Daily life regained calm, no longer dominated by insults or fear. The old man, once a silent sufferer, now carried dignity openly in his demeanor. Even simple actions like walking through the house or making meals felt lighter. The atmosphere was free of the constant tension that had defined years of living. Neighbors would nod politely or stop by, acknowledging the shift in household dynamics. The quiet presence of law and justice had reinforced respect that words never could. The son's pride had been broken, his arrogance replaced with cautious humility. He understood finally that actions have consequences, both private and public. His attempts at mocking or controlling failed entirely under the weight of truth. I remained calm, saying little, allowing the lessons to embed deeply. The old wounds, bruises, and insults faded slowly, but the memory remained sharp. Each glance at the past reminded him of the day his arrogance met justice. The neighbors, silent witnesses, became part of the lesson's permanence. Stories spread about the courage and patience of the father and the consequences faced by the son. The community recognized the rightness of action, reinforcing respect for truth and patience. Even friends and distant family who once doubted my authority now understood clearly. The home, once a place of fear, was now peaceful and orderly. Children, visitors, and relatives sensed the change, adjusting their interactions accordingly. I could walk freely, speak calmly, and move about without fear of insult. The house felt lighter, filled with the quiet satisfaction of justice fulfilled. No shouting, no aggression, only a calm authority that demanded recognition. The son, in every action, remembered the arrest and the lesson behind it. Respect, long ignored, had returned through careful, deliberate measures. The lesson had reached deeper than words, penetrating memory, conscience, and heart. Even in the weeks that followed, the household remained transformed. Old routines resumed, but each carried a new weight of respect and caution. I noticed subtle changes. My son listened more, acted cautiously, and avoided anger. The neighborhood spoke less and listened more, aware of the power of truth. My dignity, once undermined, now rested solidly, unchallenged by fear or insult. The past, full of pain and endurance, had become a foundation for strength. The arrest, though a single moment, had reshaped relationships completely. Silence no longer meant weakness, but patience with purpose. Action, deliberate and precise, had restored order to the family. The old man's quiet endurance had become a visible, undeniable force. Neighbors, once indifferent, now understood that consequences matter in every household. Even my own family recognized that justice had been served in a lasting way. The son's behavior shifted permanently, not out of fear alone, but through lesson learned. He began acknowledging responsibilities, refraining from insults, and showing caution. His arrogance melted, replaced with awareness of the impact of his past actions. The household became a place of calm authority rather than fear or intimidation. I continued to live with quiet dignity, carrying scars as reminders of lessons taught. Each day reinforced that patience, evidence, and proper action create lasting respect. Neighbors noticed the difference immediately, seeing the father now in control. The public nature of the lesson ensured that arrogance could not rise unnoticed again. The son's colleagues, friends, and peers all began to treat him differently. Whispers of past arrogance and consequences followed him, keeping humility in place. Even my presence alone commanded respect, a stark contrast to previous years. No longer would words or minor acts of violence dominate the home or street. Time continued to pass, but the lesson remained permanent in memory and consequence. The household thrived in peace, and quiet authority replaced tension entirely. The father, once silenced, now observed life with calm confidence. Every visitor, neighbor, and family member recognized the shift, subtle yet undeniable. Respect had returned through truth, patience, and deliberate action rather than shouting. The scars on my body and in my heart reminded all of the cost of endurance. I reflected on the journey from insult to public accountability. Every bruise, every hidden mark, every insult was part of a larger lesson. The silence I kept allowed me to prepare, gather evidence, and act with precision. The arrest had not just changed the son, but also the perception of family, neighbors, and community. The power of deliberate action and patience was evident in every interaction thereafter. Even years later, the memory of that day remained a cornerstone of respect. Dignity, once mocked, had returned in full force. Silence and patience, paired with calculated action, had produced lasting results. The son's behavior remained tempered, the household peaceful, and respect reinstated. I lived my days quietly, observing the impact of lessons finally learned. The neighbors, the community, and my family all recognized the authority restored. The once useless old man had proven that truth and patience outweigh arrogance and disrespect. Now, as an old man, I look back at every moment with clarity. The pain, the bruises, and the insults no longer control me. I understand that silence can be powerful, but action with truth is stronger. The years of patience, endurance, and preparation shaped the outcome I finally achieved. I faced betrayal, disrespect, and violence, yet I preserved my dignity through calculated steps. The lessons learned were not just for my son, but for anyone who witnessed the journey. Every mark on my body told a story of endurance and resilience. Each insult, though sharp and deep, became fuel for deliberate action. The community, neighbors, and family observed the consequences unfold. Respect returned not through anger or shouting, but through visible proof and courage. The son, once arrogant and cruel, learned that words and actions have lasting impact. My patience, once tested daily, transformed into authority and undeniable strength. I reflect on how easily trust and respect can be broken. A lifetime of sacrifice can be dismissed in a single moment of cruelty. Yet the restoration of dignity does not rely on apologies or change from the wrongdoer. It relies on deliberate, truthful action that enforces consequences. Every day, I see the difference in my household, a calm order replacing chaos. The silence of the old man has become a presence of power and guidance. Even the neighbors noticed the transformation, recognizing courage and resilience. They witnessed that no insult or violence could override justice and patience. The son's pride, once unshakable, had been permanently humbled. Actions have weight, and the lesson was unforgettable for all involved. Respect, once lost, was restored by evidence, courage, and firm resolve. I carry no anger today, only the understanding of how truth heals and teaches. Life is unpredictable, and family bonds can be tested in brutal ways. Disrespect and cruelty can appear suddenly, even from those we raised with love. The key to enduring such trials lies in observation, patience, and preparation. Collecting evidence and planning deliberate steps ensures consequences are real and lasting. The law, community, and proper documentation became tools of justice. The power of truth, not anger, guided my actions and restored my authority. I remember the day I picked up the phone to call 911 vividly. It was not a moment of anger, but one of controlled resolve. Years of abuse, insults, and bruises converged into a single act of justice. The arrival of officers, the visibility of evidence, and the public response cemented the lesson. Respect returned not through words, but through consequences that could not be ignored. Neighbors, family, and even the son understood the weight of truth in that moment. The aftermath solidified the transformation of relationships and dynamics. The son, aware of the public and private consequences, altered his behavior permanently. He could no longer dismiss authority, kindness, or patience with arrogance. The household gained calm, order, and a restored sense of security. My own spirit, once burdened by betrayal, felt lighter and empowered. The lesson endured because it was deliberate, visible, and undeniable. I reflect on the importance of patience in confronting cruelty. Silence is not weakness, but preparation for action that carries meaning. The old man, bruised and insulted, became a figure of quiet authority. The lesson extended beyond my son to the community, neighbors, and family. It became a living example of patience, resilience, and justice in practice. The scars remained, but they were reminders of endurance, not defeat. The day of the arrest changed everything, yet life continued in calmness. Every interaction reinforced the lesson: disrespect has consequences. My son's attitude, once reckless and arrogant, was permanently humbled. Household peace replaced tension, and my dignity was restored quietly. The lesson did not require shouting or anger, it required truth and action. I observed, waited, and acted, and the results were undeniable. Now, I tell this story to remind others of the power of deliberate action. Bravery is not only in confrontation, but in preparation and execution of justice. Patience, endurance, and careful observation transform suffering into authority. Every bruise, insult, and act of disrespect becomes part of a lesson with impact. The world notices courage when it is coupled with evidence and truth. Even in old age, the strength of patience and deliberate action shines brightly. I reflect on my journey from insult and betrayal to restored dignity. Years of endurance became a story of justice, respect, and authority regained. The neighbors, community, and family witnessed the transformation firsthand. Every insult and act of cruelty turned into proof of patience and resilience. The lessons I taught were lasting because they were deliberate and visible. Respect returned not by anger, but through thoughtful and undeniable action. The memory of that day, the police, and the public acknowledgement remains vivid. It serves as a reminder that no one, regardless of age, should be dismissed or insulted. Even the useless old man holds power when patience, evidence, and courage combine. The household, community, and family adjusted to a restored order permanently. The lesson was more than correction. It was a permanent restoration of authority. Truth, patience, and deliberate action remain the strongest tools an old man can have. Finally, I realized that dignity, patience, and preparation are more powerful than anger. The past, filled with bruises, insults, and betrayal, shaped my ultimate authority. Respect, once lost, can be regained through visible, deliberate, and truthful action. The son learned, the family observed, and the community understood the weight of consequences. Even as an old man, I feel pride in standing firm without hatred, only purpose. Final thought: he called me useless. The world saw that an old man's truth carries power.